morning. It's so good to see you again, to be in this place to worship with you. And I would be remiss if I didn't say how thankful I am to be able to be a part of your worship today. Earlier this morning, I told him that Dr. LeBlanc was so gracious to let me come and share his pulpit today, because I know that First Baptist Summit has always had great preachers. I look back over the history of your church, and you have had some outstanding pulpiteers, and God has blessed you and brought a lot of this together. It's been good for me to be able to be back here and to see a lot of people that are just dear friends of mine that I had the privilege of pastoring some years ago. And as I look out and see some of them today, there was I sort of think back, and I remember that a lot of them gave me a lot of advice when I was their pastor. You know, they always had some advice for me, and some of it I took and some of it I didn't. Now, I don't want to talk about what I did take, but there's a guy here this morning that gave me some advice, and I'm so thankful I didn't take it. And it was Dunk Wallace. Dunk tried to get me to get in the MU business. I don't know whether he remembers that or not, but Dunk wanted me to buy a couple of MUs one time, and I'm so thankful I didn't do that, Dunk. And so I just wanted to mention that this morning. That's some of that advice that you take and some you don't. But they are dear friends, and so many of you I've known over the years, and it is a joy and a privilege for me to be here today. I want to share with you this morning a message that Jesus Christ gave to his disciples and his followers one day. And if you can visualize Christ sitting perhaps at the bottom of a hill or maybe at the top of the hill, and beneath him there's a group of people who've gathered there by the Sea of Galilee. I've had the privilege to be there and look out and just see the Sea of Galilee where Jesus Christ delivered this great sermon. And Jesus Christ did say to them, "You're the light of the world," and you could actually look to your left or to your right, and you would see a city that was sitting on the hill right there beside the Sea of Galilee. But Christ said something that I want us to talk about today, is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? And he says, it is good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under the foot of men." Perhaps today, if we could visualize something that might take place, might never take place. But let's just suppose that God is sitting on his throne up in heaven, and all of his angels are gathered around him, and he's looking down on earth. And probably for about the last 50 or 60 years, he's been observing what's going on in America and around the world. No doubt, God would have seen the fighting that's been taking place in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. He has seen the atrocities that have been, committed there. People losing their lives, just annihilated, just wiped out, men, women, boys, and girls. He could look at America and he could see that in some of our cities on a weekend, 19 people have been murdered. He would be watching perhaps as a Supreme Court just recently said that the Defense of Marriage Act is no longer valid. It's against our Constitution. Perhaps he is saddened by the fact that there have been over 50 million abortions since 1972. And we can go on and on and on about the things that are happening in our world today. And perhaps God turned and looked at the angels and he said to them, "Where is the salt? Where's the salt?" Because you see, the Bible says you are to be the salt of the earth. Now, basically what Jesus Christ is saying to them, I want you to have an influence upon the world that you're going into. Now, Jesus Christ is suggesting to them that, number one, the world is dark. The world is always going to be dark. It was, it is, and it will be until Jesus comes again. But he says, not only is the world dark, but he says the world is corrupt. It is not going to get better. At the turn of the 20th century, there were a lot of people that believed down deep in their hearts that we were going to move toward a better society, that everything was going to get better. People were going to get better. People were going to treat one another better. We were going to do away with all of the evils in the world because we were going to evolve into somebody or something that was going to be much better than it had been. Well, you know the rest of the story, don't you? It hasn't happened. I got news for you. According to the Bible, it's not going to happen. It's just going to get worse. It's not going to get better. But he says, even though I'm sending you out into a world that is dark and one that is corrupt, he says, I want you to have an influence. And that's what he talks about when he says, you are to be influencers in the world in which you're going into. And he used a very simple illustration, something as common as salt. Something is salt. You are the salt of the earth. That's your influence. I remember some years ago looking at a cartoon strip. It was Andy Cap. Now, Andy Cap's always sort of been one of my favorites, and of this particular cartoon strip, Andy had gone down to the pub. Now, if you don't know what a pub is, that's a place where you can go and drink all you want and get intoxicated, inebriated. And old Andy is sitting there, and he's gotten inebriated. And in comes his wife, Flo. Flo comes walking in, and you know, usually she's got on a long robe or house coat, got her hair rolled up in curlers, and so Flo goes in and gets Andy, grabs him off the bar stool, and they start back to the house. And old Andy, he's just mully-grubbing. He looks up at Flo, and he said, Flo, you know, he said, I ain't good for nothing. That's the way he put it. And Flo looked at him and said, yes, Andy, you are good for something. Well, with that, old Andy began to smile just a little bit. And he said, Flo, what is it then? She said, Andy, you're a good illustration of a bad example. A good illustration of a bad example. Now, what she was saying was, Andy, you got an influence. And your influence is not too good right now. And perhaps that's what Christ is trying to say to his disciples. I want you to be a good, positive influence in the world in which I'm sending you. Now, I want to share with you a couple of things here, 2 or 3, 4 things actually, and we'll do it quickly. But I want to suggest to you that when we give an invitation today, you're going to have a choice to make. You can change or you can stay the same. I'm reminded of a story told by Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher. And he wrote a little story with a moral message to it. And it went something like this. It was a story about a city, and it was known as Duck City. Everybody in that city was a duck. Now, he said on any given Sunday morning, he said everybody would get up, and he said they would freshen up. They would waddle out the door, waddle down the street, the First Baptist Church, or the church in that city, and they would waddle in and sit down in their pews. Everybody's a duck now. And he said it wasn't long until the preacher would come waddling in. And he would get up behind the pulpit, and then the choir leader would come in, and the choir would come waddling in. And you know, I meant to say a few moments ago, if you minister music, who's away today is a better worship leader than Craig. You've really got a good one, haven't you? I'm telling you, you did a good job. Thank you. And so they come waddling in. Now, when they get in there and the preacher stands up and preaches his sermon, and his sermon goes something like this. He said, all of you waddled in here today. But I want you to know that we don't always have to waddle. He said, have you ever noticed the eagle, how they soar and how they can fly? And he said, I'm telling you, you can fly. You've got wings. You don't always have to waddle. You can soar like an eagle. And they were all saying, amen, preacher, preach it, preacher. And they all agreed with him. Well, he gets through with his sermon. Give an invitation. Say their prayers. They all waddle out the door. And they waddle back down the street to their house. Now, the moral of that story by Kierkegaard is, so many times we hear the words of Christ. So many times you hear the words of your pastor, your Sunday school teacher, and it makes no difference in your life. But Christ says, I want you to know that you are the salt of the earth. Now let's watch it. 3 or 4 things. Number 1, look at the words of Christ. He says, you are the salt of the earth. Now, when he uses the word you, that is emphatic. You yourselves are the salt of the earth. That doesn't mean you might be the salt of the earth. It doesn't mean that you are supposed to be the salt of the earth. What it means is you are the salt of the earth. Christ indwells you, lives within you, moral righteousness within you. He says you are to be the salt of the earth. Now, are we or are we not? Now, he goes on and he says not only is that emphatic, but it's plural. He says all of you are the salt of the earth. Not just one or two of you. And I'm sure within this congregation today, there are some of you who would perhaps qualify as perhaps a little more salty than others. But he says all of you together are to be the salt of the earth. Now, I could take this salt shaker today, take the top off of it. It's sea salt. It's sort of coarsely ground. I can take one grain out. I can put it on my tongue. It probably wouldn't make a whole lot of difference. Oh, I know it's there. But I'm telling you, if I took the whole bottle and put it in my mouth, you'd have to take me to the hospital. I mean, it's just the way it is. And so he says, what I want you to do is to all of you together, to work together to be the salt of the earth. I closed the last message out with an illustration that I think illustrates it so well. It was a magazine that came out some years ago, and about 4 different pages, and there were 4 captions. One of them, the first picture, was a large wheat field in western Kansas. The second picture was a mother sitting in a little farmhouse, wringing her hands because she had been outside taking care of the chores, and her 4-year-old had wandered away and got lost in the wheat field. Because of the height of the wheat compared to his height, they couldn't find him. He was lost. The third caption, or the third picture, was a group of Christians, or a group of friends who had come together, and they had locked hands, and they were walking through the wheat field to look for the little boy. Oh, it had been some hours. He had been exposed to the sun and the elements. And the fourth picture is of a father standing there holding in his arms a lifeless son who had been outside and exposed to the elements too long, and he had died. The caption under the picture was, "Oh God, why didn't we hold hands earlier or sooner?" And I think that's the picture of what Christ is saying here. You are the salt of the earth. All of us are. Not one or two of us, but every single one of us. We have a responsibility. Now, that's what Christ said. Is salt worth anything? Oh, you know it is. There's a lot of things you can do with salt. Man, it's important. The Greeks thought highly of it. They called it theon, T-H-E-I-O-N, which meant divine. It was one of the purest things of that day and time that they could think of. They knew how important it was. They even paid wages with salt. The Latin word, salarium, gives us our word salary. And you've heard that statement, he's not worth his salt. That meant he's not worth what you're paying him. That's exactly what it meant. And so he says, you are the salt of the earth, and it was valuable because it had so many usages. So let's quickly talk about the work of the salt. What does salt do? What did Christ have in his mind when he said to those disciples there and his followers, you are the salt of the earth? Now, we know that salt does a lot of things. It's amazing to me that you can take salt, you can put it on a tomato and it makes it a lot better. You can take salt, I like it on a watermelon, to be honest with you. You can take salt, make ice cream with it. I mean, you put all that salt in your ice cream freezer. A lot of things you can do with salt. I mean, you know, if you got grass you don't want to grow, throw salt out there. Salt can do a lot of stuff. But one of the most unusual things I've ever seen salt do in my life, I was pastoring up north Mississippi. I stopped by a little store that I did quite frequently. It's just sort of the hangout. And in that particular store one day, a guy was standing there, and he said, I bet you $5. He said, I can bring a fly back to life. I said, you can do what? He said, I can bring a fly back to life. The guy said, what do you mean? He said, okay. So the guy gets a Coke bottle, catches a fly with his hand, puts it in the Coke bottle, and fills it full of water, and turns it upside down, and drowns that fly. Drowns the fly. Everybody agreed the fly was dead. We know what we're talking about. Pours that water out. That old fly flops out on the counter. And he goes over and he gets a salt shaker. That fly is as dead, looks as dead as anything you'd ever see. Never going to fly again. But he had bet a guy $5 he could make that fly get up and fly away. Takes salt. Shakes that salt on top of that fly. You know what salt does? Pulls the water out of his pores. A fly breathes through the pores. And he pulls the salt out. You see an old wing begin to move, then you see a leg begin to move, and that fly gets up and flies away. Now, I'm telling you, there's a lot of things you can do with a salt shaker. Now, that's not what Christ was saying here. But Christ said, all right, the main thing, and I just want to get down to the main thing. Certainly it flavors. We know that. But Christ says, I want you to stop the decay and the corruption in the world. How many of you have ever seen an old-timey smokehouse? You've seen them, haven't you? I've watched people before kill a hog, as we say in the South, and then he takes that meat, puts it in a smokehouse, wraps it up in salt, hangs it up, and in the cold of the wintertime, he'll go out there and he'll get down a ham or he'll get whatever, bring it in the house, slice it up, and it's still good. Why? Because of the salt. The salt stopped the corruption. It preserved it. Now, you can take salt and put it on corruption, but it's not going to change corruption into incorruption. It doesn't have that power. But it has the power to stop corruption. And so when I look around at my world today, and I want to blame somebody else for it, maybe the Lord is saying to me, hey, wait a minute. You are the salt of the earth. And folks, if we don't try, the world is going to get worse and worse and worse. Hey, I get frustrated. I get frustrated just like you. I've watched television enough. I've watched CNN, HNN, all those other N's, Fox News. You watch it all. And I tell you what, then you have to take a sedative to go to bed and go to sleep. It's that rotten. But Christ says you're to be salt. Now, let's talk about, and wrapping it up, not only the work of salt, preserving, that was the primary function of it. And there are a lot of other ideas there. But let's just talk about that one. And then the last thing is the worthlessness of salt. Somebody says salt can't lose its saltiness. Well, Christ said it could. But basically what that scripture says, if salt becomes defiled, how can it be made salty again? Let me rephrase it. If you lose your influence, how can you regain it? If people lose respect for you, how can you regain it? It's not easy, is it? It takes a while. And so Christ is saying to them, you are worth everything to me because I'm leaving you in the world to make a difference. But what's happened? Probably, like so many of you, if you like most homes, the salt shaker is not just sitting around. It's probably up in the cabinet somewhere. Just about every church I've ever gone to, and we have a fellowship or whatever, or dinner, usually some of the dear ladies are going to go back. They're going to set everything up. But I'll tell you what they do. They go to a cabinet, they get out a big old tray, and it's got all the salt and pepper shakers on it, put them on the table. So the salt's usually sitting on a shelf somewhere in a cabinet. I want you to visualize this salt shaker being First Baptist Macomb and First Baptist Summit. I slipped up, didn't I? First Baptist Summit. So it's First Baptist Summit. And inside here, each one of you is represented by one of these little granules. I'll tell you something. As much fun as it is to be in here, jostling around with all of your friends, pardon my French, but you ain't worth a dime as long as you're in the bottle. Is that plain enough? That's about as plain as you can say it. You got to be out there in the world. That's where it is. That's what's going to make the difference. I may not be able to change anybody in Washington, but I am responsible for where Christ put me. I can't let what they're doing keep me from doing what I am supposed to do. Whether it's at home, whether it's at work, whether it's at play, whether it's at school, wherever I go, I am to be the salt of the earth. In other words, I got to get out of my bottle, and I got to get out in the world to make a difference. Years ago, there was a railroad bridge built east of Scotland called the Forth Bridge, Forth. That bridge was going to span from Edinburgh to Dundee, I believe, on the eastern side of Scotland. Still there today. And it's a cantilever bridge. I'm not an engineer, so I'm telling you things that's above my educational level, I can assure you. But I do know that when they built this thing and they got ready to connect it, they got it as closely as they could, but they couldn't put the bolts in it to fasten it. They just couldn't make it work. It was off just a little bit. Whether by design or whatever, I don't know. But you know what they did? They waited until the sun came out. It heated up. The sun caused the metal to expand, and it came together, and they fastened it. Something as common, something as quiet and unnoticeable as the sun did something that man could not do. That's what Christ says. You are to be out there expanding, preserving, doing what I've called you to do. Let's bow our heads. You're here today and perhaps God has spoken to your heart. I told you can either do one of two things. You can say, Lord, I want to make a difference. Show me how I can plug in, how I can be a change agent, how I can be salt that gets outside the shaker with my influence, that I can make others want to come to know Christ. Perhaps the Lord has been tugging at your heart and you need to come today and unite with this church and make it your church home and be a part of what God's doing right here in this place. They welcome you with open arms. But you know what you need to do. Maybe it's just come kneel in the altar and talk to the Lord and say, Lord, I've been negligent. I haven't been the salt. I haven't been as salty as you would like for me to be. And I want to recommit my life to you today. Whatever God would have you to do. We're going to pray and then we'll sing. Father, may your Holy Spirit today speak to each of our hearts. May we make that decision that you would have us to make right now in this place. Lord, I want to leave here today determined to be one that is trying to preserve the good that's in this great country that you gave to us as a gift. The good that's in this community, the good that's in this church, the good that's in the lives of the people that are here. Help us to do it, Father, is my prayer in Jesus' name.